What do you want to cover next?
Well, let's go into your. I mean, you could touch maybe on the Argentinosaurus versus Patagotitan.
Yes. All right, let's do it. So, as you can see, I finally did an illustration that doesn't make your eyes bleed so bad. The Patagotitan is the blue one, Argentinosaurus is the pink one, and this is probably that using my same assumption that they're related animals with different proportions. This is what I actually came up with. I just by accident. I was actually convinced that the Patagotitan would have a much bigger lead on the size, and admittedly, some proportions are just me depicting it. Like the belly might actually be the same, but as you can see, Argentinosaurus is taller. Patagotitan has a slightly longer, body in the trunks, than Argentinosaurus. But I would say Argentinosaurus would be a little bit thicker, and in its body, and I can't really make any statements on the length, but it would have had longer legs. It probably had a deeper chest. It might not have had quite the same length of the dorsal skeleton as Patagotitan, but this is just what the end result is. So it's possible that despite everything I kept telling everyone, after I finally looked at this, that Argentinosaurus might actually be a couple of tons heavier than Patagotitan, but this is actually assuming the maximum size based on the dimensions of the dorsal skeleton and the other bones. So, any thoughts?
Sorry, I have an idea for you.
Yeah.
Something that you might like to crack on at some point is there is another big dinosaur from Lake Maastrichtian, South America. It's called Dreadnoughtus.
Yes.
That one is actually even better preserved than any of the other large, similarly sized ones, I believe. So you could definitely consider that one to see how much it fits into this size league, whether it kind of gives up a little bit or whether it goes toe to toe, or how would that, kind of go about it?
Well, I can actually say I've done some preliminary work, and I'm kicking myself for not putting that into the chart as well. And from the sources where I've found the skeleton described, it's actually tiny compared to these two. I mean, it's not real. So unless there's some super gigantic specimen that I keep failing to find that would have actually changed everything, the one that you see depicted on the internet, in all the skeletals, that's the one I'm basically using. And that one is actually like way small, like probably half the size of these ones.
Right.
Its ground clearance is probably just above, about a 6'2" area. This is, this is a huge difference in variance. I know 6 foot and 2 meters are not actually a similar measurement, but you get the gist of it. It has a very elongated body, very short legs for its size. I could very likely assume it will have a similar posture to this, even though it's depicted as having a downward arch posture, which I'm not too sure is actually the case, because this one resolves a lot of strange kinks and twists in the postures depicted. If it just has, if this is assuming, and this is actually based on what Scott Hartman depicts, instead of the shoulder blades, going to the very top, I'm actually assuming the spine is raised higher and the shoulder blades, which seem to basically be straight vertical lines, so that is definitely possible, actually terminate before the ribs, turn back inwards again to meet the spine. So if that's the case, it would have a similar shape to this, maybe shorter limbed or elongated body, but it would be quite a bit smaller. At least that's from what I found.
Yeah, that's interesting how sometimes you discover these things when you put them in perspective. You think that, oh my God, this one might be bigger, because I wasn't actually quite under the impression that it was like huge and crazy. And then, yeah.
Yeah, the ironic thing is, it is huge. It's a massive dinosaur. But
it's still a massive dinosaur, but, we're talking about the heavyweight champions here, literally. So we might not quite get there just yet. I mean, even what Alamosaurus probably wouldn't even go toe to toe either. It would probably be about the same as Dreadnoughtus, roughly, plus or give or take maybe. But
I
not
think
the size guys.
I think so. I guess the best analog would be Brachiosaurus, would probably be a more similar size to, which I also have a comparison of, which we'll show later.
Yep.
Brachiosaurus is probably the most similar to Alamosaurus and Dreadnoughtus in terms of size. So you're not going to get a Dreadnoughtus, at least from the ones I've looked at, that are like basically like Patagonia, but shorter and stockier. So it's like, the Gimli to the Legolas, kind of comparison. The size, I think it's basically actually more like a Hobbit compared to him.
Pretty much, yeah.
Compared to everything else, it's colossal, but compared to these two, it is actually quite small, at least from the popularly shown ones on the web. So
True.
if anyone's found a study of a bigger specimen, I would definitely love to see it. I will definitely add it in, and I'll, re-evaluate what I've said so far and what my understanding of it is.
That's fair. So, shall we go into the Megafauna chart and see what that?
Yes,
that would be interesting one, I think, to look at.
All right. Do you want the super duper Megafauna one, the land animals, or do you want to jump in rhinos and proboscids first?
Let's do the let's go into the rhinos, because there was something interesting about the rhinos, and not many people know this, but some people would probably. But I'll get to that in a second.
All right. Do you want to begin?
Well, yeah. I mean, first of all, remember when we mentioned earlier on about the whole idea of having these like rare specimens and not being able to physically travel there, trying to hunt materials.
That's a funny story.
Yours truly over here was lucky at the time that I had a trip planned over to my hometown in Russia, which is Rostov-on-Don in the south of Russia. And it also happens that 40 minutes away from the Rostov-on-Don city, there is a smaller city called Azov. And this is where the specimen of the biggest rhino you see here, which is Elasmotherium caucasicum, is being held at. And the skeleton is mounted. Lucky for me, I was able to take very nice straight shots from the front and from the side as well. And voila, you have it right here, reconstructed.
Yep.
Those pictures, however reliable or not, with margin of error they are. But it's the best we got.
Yeah. And I got to say, so everyone who likes Elasmotherium caucasicum, you owe AK for it. Is the reason this depiction is possible to exist. And that is actually a bit of a funny story as well. So I wanted to depict Elasmotherium caucasicum for so long. It was just like an ephemeral dream I had. If only I had a picture of a skeleton, a mounted skeleton shown from the side, and I could just illustrate it. That's how I've illustrated a lot of things in the past. I've quite a few of my depictions are actually just straight off isometrically taken photographs. Because if it's a complete specimen, why not? If it's well photographed, I could work with it. And I was able to actually do this with Elasmotherium sibericum, which is the next biggest one. And that was possible because eventually I managed to find, after trawling through so many photos of people taking those really cool diagonal kind of close-up of the horn shots, they're no good for me. I can't work with that. So I was thinking, okay, well, that's cool. And what about caucasicum? That thing sounds like it's twice as big. This is going to be so amazing. But I can't find it. And I was just getting annoyed. And I'm thinking, this is unfair. This is unfair to anyone who speaks, English and doesn't know how to use Cyrillic characters. I'm like, Harry, you idiot. So I get out and Google Translate. I enter Elasmotherium. Actually, this is how I found Elasmotherium sibericum, actually. I typed in Elasmotherium sibericum and translated it into Russian Cyrillic, which is actually the exact same word. It's just using slightly different characters.
Yep.
I copy-pasted that, put it back into Google, and oh, wow, that's actually much better. There's like a gazillion, trillion, billion results, because the vast majority of people that would have been taking photos of that display would most likely have entered it into Russian social media. So it's like, easy. Okay, cool, let's do it. Found it, depicted it, that's fine. But luckily, as AK made that trip and mentioned it, I'm like, oh, well, if you're going, you wouldn't happen to be able to get photos of this particular specimen. And he did. And it was perfect. They were just perfect sideways shots that I could easily put together also of the display showing exactly how big the specimen should be. And because I know enough about skeletal anatomy, I was able to, work with it. And luckily, the museum display did a good job of actually putting it up to begin with, because a lot of museum displays just, it makes my blood boil just seeing.
Comes to taking good pictures sometimes, and it's either like they have them behind glasses which reflect too much, so you cannot anything if you need the right angle. And the other thing that was really good is that although it was obviously separated by like a temporary sort of placeholder kind of fence, with a rope or whatever, but that was no big deal. I didn't have to get inside. I just needed a good angle. And also lucky that the photographs were allowed. They weren't being very nasty about it, because some museums get a hissy-facey about photographs, and this one was very cool.
Your flash will destroy the specimen. Well, I mean, to be fair, splashes do actually destroy specimens. That's probably why they're so pedantic about it.
The paintings, maybe, at least.
But this is fortunate.
Paintings, for example, especially in like museums like the London Wallace collection or whatever, they say if you are taking pictures, make sure you don't put the flashes on.
Yes, absolutely. And that's very important.
But yes, this specimen, it just happened by luck that I was just saying, and Harry just like popped the question, like, so did you say you're going to Russia? Are you by any chance like in that area? And like when somebody says I'm going to Russia, just to give you some context, Russia is like obviously 1/6 of the entire landmass of the world. You could end up basically in one area which is like close to Japan, in like Vladivostok or Khabarovsk, which is a totally opposite end of the continent overall. There's like which is like obviously the Asian part of Russia, and there's like the European part, which is close to the Baltic border, or Belarusian, whatever, not Belarusian, sorry, Ukrainian border, which is where my hometown is, and that's where Azov museum is, because that's where the city of Azov is. And actually we have family friends who live in Azov as well, so it's only 30 to 40 minutes to drive there. And basically me, my brother, my younger brother, and my cousin, obviously cousin who lives locally, he got a car, so he just like picked us up and he's like, hey, let's go together. I'm like, yeah, let's go, why not? So we just went together and drove there, parked pretty much outside the museum in a central street, and just like went inside. And there was a steppe mammoth skeleton there, a big mound.
Oh, nice.
Huge. It's massive. And there's a Dynatherium. I believe it's Giganteum, I think, or whatever. That's
That's what Giganteus, I think.
There was also a steppe bison in there as well.
Nice.
And I can't remember exactly what else, but there were a few other things, and they're mostly fragmentary, like different elephant proboscians, basically, of some different types, which have been identified, but they're very fragmentary in the museum. So there's just like a couple pieces, like teeth, bones, maybe like stuff like that. So no mounted skeletons of them, but still documented. And the other thing that's interesting is that I think Caucasicum is ancestral to the Sibiricum.
Wow.
Which I think that is the case, and that's what makes it very interesting, because this kind of coincides with how steppe mammoth is considered to be ancestral to woolly mammoth. So the earlier, basically, ancestral versions seem to be a little bit upgraded on the size, and then they downgrade slightly as they get to later ice age, which is quite interesting.
Yeah, it's like the cave lions as well. Apparently their ancestral lions were a little bit bigger, and actually, ironically, they also lived in probably colder climates, but I think it was Beringian or something like that. I don't remember. But so it could just be an effect of the climate. Maybe they just had less food to eat. Maybe they, the warmer environment, became disadvantageous for thick-bodied, larger animals.
Just shaped it that way, so they just changed to the point where they basically just become completely different species, so they cannot be characterized the same. It's basically like the anagenesis sort of thing, like you have with different species of Pachyrainosaurus, which never coexisted, presumably, together. They were all just direct transformations and ancestral descendant version, or so it is actually proposed anyway, to what we know. And the same with the Splitosaurus, Hornorhynchus, like those things. There are many other cases you could make up. Giganotosaurus, Bapusaurus, perhaps, is the similar case as well. And So yeah, there's tons of these. So this is another example of those. And of course, you see there is a white rhino, and there is also the woolly rhino, and in the forefront you have the black rhino with a very weird looking horns.
Indeed. So where to begin?
Yeah, what? How did you find the one? How did you come across this specimen of the black rhino that you are depicting here with these weird-looking horns?
Lots and lots and lots and lots of photographs, basically, and a lot of them have the weird horns. So people are probably wondering, is that really the case? Honestly, this rear horn here is actually a little bit conservative. Sometimes their rear horns are like this giant spade-shaped thing that clearly outreaches out and is wider and longer and thicker in every way than the front horn, and that's usually not the case for rhinos. In fact, I'm pretty sure of a lot of prehistoric rhinos, this is literally the only one I can think of where the rear horn is just outright bigger than the front horn. The front horn's not some kind of strange atrophying feature. They just both have these humongous sized horns, and it varies between individuals. Sometimes they're smaller, sometimes they're thinner, sometimes they're just wider, and honestly, I don't know why. It just seems to be they just freely do that.
Yeah, that's interesting. I've never known that. That's why I'm asking, because black rhinos generally, they always been a bit more obscure to me, because when you talk about African rhino, I always think of the white rhino most of the time, because it's more common general species. Obviously, there are subspecies of white rhinos as well, and there are different ones, and some of them have already gone extinct. Some of them are still around, and hopefully will persist. But with the black rhino, I always found them to be a little bit more mysterious, of the two species.
And there's actually a good reason for that, and it's simply the fact that it's actually partly good news. So as everyone knows, unfortunately, the northern white rhino is now classified as extinct. There's only 2 left, and they're a mother and daughter. So yeah, they're gone.
Is it the northern or the southern one?
The northern one's the one that went extinct. It's a slightly smaller species.
Right.
The southern one, however, is actually quite a success story. It's doing incredibly well, and given that, it was actually very close to extinction as well. I think its numbers were down to a 4-digit number or a 3-digit number or something really horrible. It was, looking bleak. But now it's in the tens and tens of thousands. There's lots of them around, and partly it's because they're actually very happy to breed in captivity. They don't get upset about, living in zoos as much. They happily, spend the time making little rhinos and repopulating the world. And also when they're put in national parks, on top of, everyone trying their best to defend them from poachers, is that they can actually defend themselves from predators and other herbivores that would actually normally try to kill them. So
rhinos are no pushovers. I can tell you that much. Elephants don't always mess with them, as far as I know.
I've seen elephants try to mess with them, and at the first opportunity, they'll stomp them to death. But the white rhino is actually large enough and has that huge long horn, most likely specifically to defend itself against elephants. Elephants are really mean and nasty, and they will try to attack. The white rhino actually is able to fend it away, and that's miraculous. So everyone thinking of Baba or that elephant cartoon character, he's so nice and his rhino neighbor's so mean. If anything, it's the opposite in real life. Elephants are mean. Rhinos just try to mind their own business, and
rhinos to kill them. So the African savannah, so to speak, pretty much. They stick to themselves, by themselves. They don't like to be bothered and disturbed. So they don't like to be messed with. But they're mostly their own things. Elephants can be, they can be, especially bull elephants. I heard they can be quite. Well, they can be dickheads.
Oh yeah, they're monsters. It's basically the reason we keep seeing white rhinos all the time is because they're by far the most common. There's tens of thousands of them. Most of the, I think, successful rehabilitation has been applied to the white rhino, and so they're just the easiest to capture on film, and that's why we have such an abundance of white rhinos. And you can actually tell the real difference between white and black rhinos, not because they're actually white and black. I think that's just the colored dirt they like to roll in.
Yeah, it's also individual variation as well, sometimes based on the exposure to sun as well, because the skin can also change color based on how it responds to the sunlight.
Yeah.
So their lips.
Their lips. So every time you see a picture of a rhinoceros that has a big block head with wide lips, that's the white rhino. It's also called the wide-lipped rhino, and the reason for that is it likes to eat grass. So it basically makes sense to have big, wide, cow-like mouth to just fit all the food in it can fit. While the black rhino with the hook-shaped lips likes to eat, likes to browse. It likes to eat from bushes and maybe short trees and scrubs and shrubs. It doesn't really like to eat grass that much, and as a result, it makes more sense to have technically they have a trunk of sorts. Like they have a little tiny trunk that reaches around, grabs the plants and tugs them off and puts them in its mouth. So that's the true reason for their differences of shapes. And you can also see the white rhino has a really long head, so it can easily reach the ground. Black rhino, not quite so much because it doesn't graze. It just reaches for plants right in front of its face.
It's a functionality-related anatomical differences, basically.
Yeah,
and of course,
Hmm?
we have the woolly rhino, which unfortunately is extinct, but it would have been quite fascinating to see this one real close and alive as well.
Yes, and there's actually a bit of another ongoing tragedy is that there is actually a living relative of that rhino that's around right now, but it is very heavily endangered, and its conservation efforts aren't, obviously need a lot more help. So if anyone wants to help a rhino, this would be the one to do. It's called the Sumatran rhino. And for that matter, there's also the Javanese rhino, which is actually Javan rhino, which is similar to the Indian rhino. But the woolly rhino's relative is the Sumatran rhino, and is actually a woolly rhino in itself. It's just that it lives in a tropical area, and so it sheds its hair more easily. But it's a similar-ish size to the black rhino. It's it actually has a pretty cute face. Actually, it's sort of a cute, ugly face, and it actually has the wrinkly things of Indian rhinos.
Yeah, that's definitely fingers crossed they will be able to succeed to reintroduce them properly. Because look at some of the successful histories of how they managed to reintroduce populations, like the American alligators, or even by the way, for example, Siberian tigers almost been hunted down to the point where people thought that they were just gonna go, and right now they're being heavily repopulated. And I mean, if there is anything that I'm not to get political, obviously, because I stay away from politics on my channel, but something that I commend, some Russian, local authorities on encouraging is that they encouraged a lot of the breeding programs and conservation areas to to reintroduce and repopulate the areas with Siberian tigers, and they have like so many of them right now working very hard. So that's really good. Nice. Especially they have like these basically they're like the lone forest guys who just live in a hut in the forest, and they pretty much are the ones who look after them, and they can they sometimes even go around if they can get close enough, or if they if they sedate them for medical inspection reasons or something, they tag them as well with like bracelets or whatever. So they always find like ways to kind of keep an eye on them. So we got more people like forest guys like that. Basically, they're like rangers, you would say, but they don't really work officially. They're like informal. They just look after the local things. They're the kind of guy who basically he has like a whole tray of things that after he if he hunts for like fresh meat, which he usually does, if he like hunts a boar during the season, and he processes, dissects it for meat and for hides and stuff like that, and whatever you can basically extract from it, and all of the things that he cannot take out from it to sell it to the markets or to the restaurants or whatever, then he puts it in this tray, and at certain time wolf packs come in and they just eat it, finish it off, and then they just sleep a little bit there for digestion.
Oh, that's great. That is so good.
We're like that, living a lot in those areas of Russia. We're talking like Siberian, kind of tundras, stuff like that. So
yeah, that's amazing.
Many of them are not even Russian, by the way. They're not even native Russian. They're like from other, places, because Russia used to be like a home. Just the land itself used to be a home from so many different, both Turkic tribes and all of these different like Mongoloid, people, folk, everything. It's insane. That's why whenever you meet a Russian person, you will find that a lot of them, they're not 100% Russian. They always had either Mongol, Tatar, or some other kind of ancestry. So just a quick side note there as well for those
That's pretty cool.
Who don't know. So yeah, I mean, but yeah, to say something more about it, that yes, there's been a lot of really successful breeding programs in that area as well on that front line. And so far, so good. So we'll see how it goes further. Let's hope that it's going to continue so we can see more tigers, in that area to kind of repopulate. And more rhinos too would be good.
Oh, that would be amazing. It'd be great to bring them back from the brink, because they are literally a link to the past to the woolly rhinos themselves, and they are actually the closest known relatives of the woolly rhinos, as far as I'm aware. And so the woolly rhino itself is interesting. We actually know a lot about it. We know what its hair color is. We know what its actual body shape was. We know what its face looked like, because we actually found mummified ones, and that's pretty much what I based this reconstruction of, and all the colorations that go with it. And you can notice the strange sort of muzzle they have, which is sort of like a big blunt one with the nostrils sort of not flared but puffed around. That's actually what they had. And I actually use that as a basis for the Elasmotheriums, not because they're related, because they are absolutely 100% not remotely related at all. It's just because I expect it's convergent evolution of the fact they live in a similar environment, they eat similar food, they both love to eat grass, and they would have the covered nostrils just to stop heat escaping.
Yeah, there's a lot of that to note as well, that these Elasmotheriums that we have here, they are actually, a different family of the, they're still part of the big, clade of these that you would consider. I don't remember the exact name of their family that includes all these, like both the Paraceratheriums and all of them. All of these are technically rhinos, but they are not. What's that?
Rhinoceratoidae, I think it is.
I'm not gonna be able to confirm, honestly. I don't even want to try, because I'm just gonna mess this one up.
They're rhinos.
Just rhinos, yeah.
Yep.
But if we talk about, what we know as the true rhino, to kind of metaphorically identify it like that, like we see here in the picture, Elasmotherium is not quite the true rhino yet.
Yep.
So that make that one clear as well.
Yep. There'll be a lot of that.
Same umbrella sort of family, but they're still very different.
Oh, yeah. And that's actually something we'll be covering pretty much immediately next. If there's anything else we want to cover about the rhinos,
I'm quite happy with what we've got. If there's nothing else to add, of course, it's nice that you've included this side note at the bottom. The photography by AKRX. That's nice. Call out there, not just verbal, but you actually included it in the notes, which is nice. Thank you. I'm very humbled. And I don't know what else, man. I think this is pretty much. I'm sorry, just need to click on this quickly. Yeah, there we go. So I'm pretty happy with the way this is going. So shall we go to the next slide? Let's just break that down.
Let's just do the general very, very large mammals, which comprise of proboscids and more rhinos, basically. Yeah. So this is a good way to start. Don't do that. Come on, why aren't you doing... there we go. So this is that same Elasmotherium caucasicum that we were talking about before. The biggest thing in the chart, right from before, is now by far the smallest. Yes. To be fair, this thing, actually, here, the African bush elephant, this is actually scaled to the very biggest size of the very biggest specimen, and that specimen is a freakish giant. Normally they go to 3 meters tall, which is actually about the same as the Elasmotherium right here. However, those would still be bigger because, as you can see, this fellow has a sloping back, because a lot of these, northern tundra kind of animals had big fat humps on their backs. This elephant has a straight back with its hips more or less the same height. It is just big because it's huge. So that's something to keep in mind.
We now shifted the scales quite a bit. Mm-hmm. So chart pretty much is dominated by proboscians. So we only have 2 rhinos basically from this family on this chart. One is the smallest and the other one is the second biggest.
Yeah, that's right. In every way possible. So just a quick forewarning, this chart is just scaled by how tall the animals are compared to the next one. So there's not an exact linear increase in size. However, it's close. swap the mammoth and the Zygolophodon / very, very large mastodon places, and you'd actually have a nearly pretty good linear increase in actual mass too. But as it is, yeah, just keep that in mind. So this is, again, something that I haven't released before. This is just something I'm slowly putting together. Like, hopefully I can get a few more mammoths and the Asian elephant as well, which I'll put in. And a quick little thing to mention, the animals we call the African elephant and the Asian elephant, well, I mean, because we call them both elephants, but by doing so, a lot of these animals, especially the mammoth and the Paleoartist, last time I checked, were considered more close related to the Asian elephant than the African elephant is. So they're actually very different animals.
They are, yes. And this is why, because today we have mostly the two major, groups which are divided into African and Asian elephants. They do have some of their own sort of species, subspecies, but generally we have two groups of the species that are divided based on just the continent. And because they also share a lot of looks, but they may just be a different location and different, growths, whatever that you can find. But here, if you were to basically just miraculously resurrect all of these, presumably that if they're obviously from all different time periods as well, they're not the same time period animals, but let's say you were to just repopulate them right now, today, you would have to be extremely specific about when you say Asian elephant. Are you talking about the modern, as Asian elephant, or are you talking about the now presumably alive and resurrected Paleoartist Pneumaticus, which is a completely different animal altogether as well? So, although closely related, but still, the size differences especially are extreme, because this animal is huge. Although it's fragmentary, I think, but it's still very huge.
They have a few arm bones and a few leg bones, and they are massive. We also have close relatives of Paleoartist Pneumaticus, including Paleoartist, I think it's Anticus or Anticatus. And
there is called Paleoartist Reki or Reki. I think there's a third one, also quite big.
Yep. They're both known for more or less complete specimen skeletons, and they're massive as well. If I were to put them in the chart, they would probably be, they'd probably be about the same size as the steppe mammoth, more or less, in terms of mass. And it's based on Anticus that I basically earned the Pneumaticus reconstruction. Although that said, what I did is I took both skeletons, morphed them a bit so that the proportions of the limbs of Reki and Anticus would match the limbs Laramendi suggested for Pneumaticus. And curiously, they both very much point to more or less the same body shape, which is what I went with. I mean, Reki has a slightly skinnier torso, and Anticus has a thicker, fatter one. So I basically erred to the Anticus because it's the closer relative. And also, I guess it just means that it's the maximum size if you want to take it to its, logical conclusion. So this is about as big as that animal could possibly get. And actually, this is a bit of a funny thing. So in my original chart, I made this back in the days when, what was it called? The Sungari mammoth was still believed to exist.
Right.
So the Songhua River mammoth, it was called. It was like this amazing, elephant-sized mammoth. It had like a 5.3 meter shoulder, and it was like, oh wow, this is amazing. This captures the imagination so much. And I added it to my original chart, and it was so excited. And then just a while later, it just seems to have disappeared. And when I tried to look it up, it's just redirected to the steppe mammoth, and they said, oh yeah, people thought that the Songhua mammoth is real, but it was a steppe mammoth. It was made from different skeletons, and it's smaller. I'm like, but the arm measurements suggested had a 5.3 meter size. How does that work? What happened to that animal? I'm guessing it was probably belonging to the Paleoartist, and that's my theory anyway, because there's no other way that a steppe mammoth could, mixed with a bunch of other bones, could somehow compute something that big, unless those bones in question was Paleoartist. And I've got to say, for anyone who's disappointed about, the super giant mammoth not existing, I can say Paleoartist of a similar shoulder height would be vastly, vastly bigger than a mammoth. And simply because, and you can't see it here, but the mammoth's tall because it has really long front legs compared to its back legs. So it stands up very upright. Its back slopes very downwards quite a bit. So it'd be, I wouldn't say a meter difference in height. That might be exaggerating, but it is quite a big difference. Paleoartist, its hip height is almost the same as its shoulder height, meaning it's as big as it is, not because it has tall shoulders. It's just big as it is because it's just outright massive, despite not having tall shoulders. Just to show how extreme this size truly is. It is an absolute behemoth, and we will see how it scales up to some actual huge dinosaurs shortly. But for now, there's quite a bit of interesting things to cover with the proboscids. Obviously, I couldn't fit them all in because there's so many, but I wanted to talk a bit about Dynatherium because this has been, ironically, one of my most controversial depictions, it seems. So,
Okay.
Yes. So as you will probably see from most depictions, they are always given tiny little short trunks, probably about less than half the length I depicted. And the reason for that is partly from the slightly odd skull shape, where it has like this extra thick supportive bit sticking out to the trunk attaches to, and also on the basis that it lived in heavily forested areas and therefore was probably a high browser because it had really tall limbs. So the theory was it would, just reach around with its little short trunk and snatch things out of trees at head height. However, there's a lot of problems with this assumption, and even though I'm taking going against my usual policy of, being top-down assumptions on it, this has to be an exception to the rule.
Mm-hmm.
Firstly, elephants, besides all of them having clearly very long limbs for their size and standing in an incredibly high position, one of the reasons they have long trunks is two, actually. One is it allows them to drink without having to basically lie on the ground, which is something no herbivore does at all. It's just energy intensive, and they will probably need to drink more than they will need to eat. So being able to drink while standing is a massive energy saver, and it seems like a very solid evolutionary consistency that has seemingly always happened, that plant eaters, grazers, foragers always have neck, head, trunk, whatever anatomy, so they could reach down and drink water without needing to necessarily move its legs around. Giraffes do it, but they don't strictly have to. I've seen footage of them just not bothering to stretch their legs out at all. It's just something they can choose to do, something they don't have to. And theoretically, that's where I'm going with. A giraffe doesn't actually need to actually do it if it was actually to reach it. They just seem to do it just because it's easier for them. While elephants, they just hang their heads over the edge of the water, stick their trunks in, and start drawing water out. So that would obviously be a problem with a short trunk Dynatherium. How does this thing drink and not die? Does it wade into the water, or does it sort of shuffle on its belly and reach over? Yeah, or does it just have a long trunk? The second factor is...
Yeah, sorry.
Oh, you go first.
Oh, you go first, because you were saying the second one, because I was going to just interject to say that look at the Paraceratherium, that it also has this kind of design that it will allow its neck to probably lower, in contrast to what you see on like the elephants and stuff. Absolutely.
So that's something you see with pretty much all of they call the hyraxids or something of those, that family of rhinos. That pretty much seems to be a consistent feature of all of them. They have long legs, they also have long necks, and they have long heads, and probably had longer faces protruding from them to be able to do this. And that seems to be a very consistent, it's very safe rule of thumb that if a grazer has long legs, it probably had everything from the shoulder would have collectively been able to reach the ground without having to really move, bend its knees that much. However, the other factor is, and this is what I think really should make a lot of sense, we actually do have a proboscid that we do know lives in dense forested environments, that is in part a high browser. that lives today, and it's called the Asian elephant.
Yeah.
Asian elephants live in forests. They live in forests. They eat things from the trees, from anything they can reach, and they have long trunks. And the advantage of this is they don't have to move around as much to actually reach things. Theoretically, if something was at head height, instead of having to walk up close and have the convenience of having a short trunk that it doesn't have to lift, it could just lift its trunk, which is pretty light compared to the rest of its body, which would have to actually walk the space to close the distance, and actually just reach out and grab things. And this, I feel, are two very massive ecological factors that should really help debunk the short trunk Dynatherium. It's just too impractical and too needlessly inconsistent on a feature that I'm pretty sure is partly elongated through use through, again, phenotypic plasticity of, because you see elephants born with little short trunks, they use them a lot, and the more they seem to use them, the longer it helps them stretch. And I don't see why that would be any different for any other proboscis.
That makes sense.
And I think as well, another thing to consider is that strange skull shape with the big protruding bone, nasal bone. If you look at the head of this thing, even the larger headed relative, you can see that their heads are much smaller for their size compared to any other proboscids here. So it's entirely possible this could actually be a compensatory mechanism around that. I mean, I will talk about it more in the future, and I'll release some informatics to add some things to think about. But this is why I depict the trunks as being long. There is just too many factors against it being short that I wanted to err with going with the flow with every other illustrator. And I think that's always a thing. There's a bit of peer pressure to go with commonly accepted sentiment without really analyzing why that would be the case. And usually it's assumption anyway.
I would actually favor your approach. And obviously here on this channel, we like to stress that science is not a democracy. It's not about how many people agree or disagree. It's about simply which hypothesis actually can stand on its own 2 feet and which one cannot. That does not in any way relate to obviously how many people favor the hypothesis or not. So which is why I would say eliminating peer pressure from this is a good idea. It's a very good way to isolate the variables, and the more of them you can obviously isolate, the more likely you're going to find yourself in a more comfortable place, but comfortable not in a sense of personal feelings, but comfortable that all of your tick boxes when you try to check your scientific main points and sources, that they all check out and they all seem to be kind of making sense, and something you can probably even test hopefully in the long run as well.
And I should mention, I actually did try to find anything that could possibly shed light on the viability of the long trunk or the short trunk. Sadly, they didn't really have anything that tested it or anything. There was just academic papers just making assumptions pretty much like the way I'm making an assumption. So sadly, I couldn't really find anything more substantial than assumptions. And I did actually have to apologize to someone who asked what my evidence was for it having a long trunk, and I just said, unfortunately, I don't have any. I actually tried to check, and it seems no matter what, the sources just make a guess like I did. So alas, sometimes that's just the limit. I mean, admittedly, if I found one that had some kind of definitive basis for the long trunk or the short trunk, I would have just gone with that, and then I could just have an actual source that I could say. But alas, this thing seems to be up in the air. And before I move on, I do want to credit Azia Laramendi, who does the amazing proboscid study in which most of these skeletals are based on.
Sure.
Azia actually depicted a viability of a certain semi-short length trunk by showing the animal dipping its head down and touching the ground. And I think that would actually be a viable, alternative to what I depicted. I'm basically assuming it doesn't bother even lowering its neck in just being able to reach anyway. But that said, if that's wrong, Azia's version would definitely be what you should be looking at, because Azia actually shows a viable short trunk limit that you can still reach the ground. So that's what I'd recommend looking at.
That's fair. All right.
All right.
Well, yeah, lots of cool stuff here, and lots to talk about as always. Yeah, I mean, look at how long. By the way, I haven't checked. Oh, dude, oh, it's crazy, and don't be pressured by any chance. But yeah, just wanted to say, 3 hours 35 minutes now.
Oh wow. Okay, so I'll probably
This
just
is gonna
quickly go through. I'll go through the rest. I'll leave the big thing at the end as a big sort of thank you for sticking around as at the end part, and
because I think that one will be a good final pieces. So if you have anything in between to fill it up, then feel free to do that first, and then we can go the final sort of megafauna and just do that and basically say our farewells for at least for the time being. And
absolutely.
Yeah, this is going to be a one big sort of lecture sort of material rather than a short video, obviously.
Yeah, fair enough. So just to clarify, these are actually two completely different species of Dynatherium. This one's Giganteus. The small one, ironically, is Giganteus, and Gigantium, I think. The larger one is the Thracian one, Thraciensis, I think it's called. So if a few people have asked, why did you update the Dynatherium? I haven't actually updated. They're just two completely different species. Next up, basically, Zygolophodon Borsoni is actually the third largest animal depicted here. Reason it's not as tall is because it's short and thick and fat. It's actually the largest of the mastodonts. I'm not sure how precisely a mastodon it is, but we do know that they did have short, shaggy fur, and they lived in forests in America. I think they lived at a similar, moderately overlapping times with the mammoths of the area. Obviously, they just lived in different biomes because the mammoths are more open plains, while mastodons are foresty.
I think they are what a commonly known American mastodon, which is what we normally know is the Mammut americanum. It's the one that lived together with Colombian mammoth. This is what I definitely know because they definitely coexisted in the same habitat and the time period as well. I don't know about this particular one, unfortunately, because that one I really looked into.
Yeah, I do recall that might have actually, I don't remember where it lived. I'm not sure it was actually an American mastodon. I think they did live in other parts of the world as well, but don't quote me on that because the geographical positioning is something that I have to usually very meticulously check before I submit works. That's usually not the forefront of what I look into, although it is very fascinating sometimes when I capture it and being able to know the geographical distribution of things. Sometimes I get surprised a lot, and that will happen quite a bit. Next up, steppe mammoth. It's one of the tallest and heaviest mammoths that we know of, and they pretty much lived around northern Europe, Siberia, I think. And even though the tusks look short, this is sadly where sideways depictions fall flat on the head. It actually has quite a lot of... It sticks out laterally, yeah. They're actually very long tusks. It's just that they mostly stick out sideways and come back. Little fun fact, by the way. The woolly mammoth apparently appeared on Earth, what was it about, relatively recently among all these elephants, including, apparently, compared to the African elephant. Yeah. Like, obviously, mammoths predated the African elephant quite a bit, but the African elephant actually started appearing on a fossil record, apparently, according to the Australian Museum, 2 million years ago. Right. So there's apparently quite a few mammoths that actually started appearing after the African elephant was already around. So yeah, so they technically were coexisting in the sort of the time period at least. So it's very interesting. So obviously next up is the largest rhinoceratoid. Unicorn. Basically rhino. Yeah. That ever lived. It was a Hyraxodont or Hyraxodont. It's basically a group of hornless rhinoceroses with elongated limbs. And obviously the largest of which happens to be the second largest mammal of all time that ever walked on land, and that's Paraceratherium. It is absolutely massive. It has pretty skinny limbs, which is what a lot of people are kind of shocked to see, and an incredibly fat, massive, heavy body. So it really shows the limits of what, mass, what kind of strength of limb can support such huge mass.
Yeah, they are very interesting. I remember when I first discovered them in a book or something like that as a kid as well. And I was like, what are these things? What are they supposed to be? And then I read that apparently, yeah, they're related to rhinos. And I'm like, wow, this thing does not look like a rhino to me, until I, of course, started seeing more depictions where they start showing, more similar features like the lip areas, the mouth, generally the ears and how they're positioned and stuff. Then I start saying, okay, so I see that they're now being more depicted like the rhinos. But back in the days as a kid, before I started even looking into like who was related to who, I just, and I think if it looks like it, then probably it's related. If it doesn't look like it, it's not related. But that's, how probably a lot of kids think in general. If things look alike, then they're probably related. So, which is not
on that. You go first.
I was saying that it's not always the case. That's it. I'm done.
Yeah, actually, I was going to jump on that point. Sometimes it's really, really, really not the case. And something that actually surprised me, and I'm sure will actually surprise a lot of people that depict it, is that rhinos and elephants, contrary to old terminologies of categorization of ruminants, they're not related at all. They are not. I mean, to emphasize this, not just, the different groups of animals, we are more closely related to rhinos, and rhinos are more closely related to us than either of us are related to elephants. Elephants are like belong to some weird proto group of placental mammals that diverged very early before any of the others did. Pretty sure all these other, like proboscids, belong to a group called Tetratherians, and they're like so divergent from any other mammal. You could pretty much make a big list of any mammal that comes to mind, and as long as it's not either a manatee, an elephant, an anteater, or an armadillo, those animals will all be more closely related to each other than any of them will be to an elephant. So
yeah,
that's
always like a thing that's going on about this relationship, because I always remember there's been like a lot of craziness about the placental, mammals and stuff like that, how they are all related to each other, and specifically where humans, Homo sapiens, would fit on this whole picture. And I heard a lot of people arguing about this. I don't get into this because it's too confusing for me. But yeah, it's just something to side note.
Yep. So every time you see a picture of a Paraceratherium with the big floppy giant elephantine ears and a trunk, no, that's no, don't, just no, bad. Paraceratheriums the limitation of their ability to have a trunk is the fact that we have rhinos, like the lipped rhinos, that have sort of like a vaguely appendage-like lips, and that's about as far as Paraceratherium would go. Otherwise, any possible similarities with elephants would be purely coincidence, extreme divergent evolution, and I honestly think they probably won't have much of a trunk because they already have such a huge elongated neck that they probably wouldn't need much more than a enlarged mouth, which is what I depicted.
Yeah, they would just be a lot more flexible as well in terms of what they can do. Because if you look at the anatomy right now here, you can see that it would basically be able to lean, it would be able to twist and turn a lot better than the other animals depicted here in this picture. More so than many other rhinos, in fact. If you really look, that's partially what makes them unique too. They are very long-necked animals.
And that's an interesting thing, is you can actually see in baby rhinoceroses of certain species, I think it's the black rhinoceros, that you're going to see this, their babies actually start off as having very elongated neck, head, limbs. So that's actually what I based the reconstruction of this thing on, is looking at them, because you can see a viable basis of how such elongated rhinos could evolve. It's just that they happen to mature and go in a different direction. At maturity, they just bulked out instead of becoming more elongated. If they continue to just grow larger in the shape they had, you get something not too dissimilar to what Paraceratherium has.
Yeah, right on.
I think that covered.
Yeah, so you go. Now you first.
No, you first.
Okay. Now I was just gonna ask if you got any more things to comment on making this particular piece.
Well, I originally made one a while back that was just a crude throw together, and then I got rapidly better at understanding rhino anatomy and how the body fits together, how the bones fit together. For example, unlike humans, or for that matter, elephants, where the whole shoulder part is its own distinct segment, independent of the rest of the body. Like you can see, it's not attached in any shape or form except at the very base. A lot of ungulates and just lots of animals in general, the shoulder is actually fully incorporated into the torso. So it's like the muscles all kind of interconnect, the skin doesn't separate. It's basically invisible. And you can see on, for example, the Paraceratherium, that bone would be about there. That's the actual shoulder. So that whole bit of limb sticking out is actually the forearm, basically the elbows just sticking out of the chest, the wrist, and like basically the whole length of the hand and the little tiny fingers at the end. So that's just something in case anyone's wondering about the strange anatomical shape of it. But yeah, that's just things I learned, and just the way that you kind of learn that humans are very strange animals in terms of anatomy. Like, we're probably the most shrink wrapped of all the terrestrial mammals when you think about it.
Yeah, if you look at all other animals, they tend to build up a lot of fat reserves, for like winters and all that stuff.
Baggy skin.
We don't necessarily do that. We kind of just vary between, people either having very average weight, overweight, low weight, like all of these, but we don't actually have any specific sort of relationship of seasonal sort of thing that I've noticed. That, like, look, I don't put on weight at all. It's going to make a lot of people jealous, especially some, people I know in my closest surroundings. Because like everybody's like at home, they're all like, oh, I'm on a diet, and I'm like, I bring this.
Yes, I'm one of those jealous people. I have to very much keep active to slim down a bit.
Prawns, though. You got your prawns and squids and stuff like that, so you got some stuff. And over here, this stuff over here costs a lot more than over probably in your areas, because over here we it's only if you go to like the seaside. If you go to like London or any like London-based areas, if you go to supermarkets, everything that is like seafood related, aside from just like fish and stuff like that, they rip you off on that stuff over here.
Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah, so the details, but still, you know what I mean. It's,
yeah, we do get easy access to seafood here, which is always a bonus. Whatever we don't.
One day, I'm making my way there slowly, baby steps.
Awesome. I can take you to either the fish markets or a shop in Parramatta that's very nice. But yes, failing that.
Food seems to always sneak into our conversations here. Speaking of which, mammoth meat and mammoth steaks, huh? Heard a few things about something that I think there was something that was mentioned about it on one of my other interviews a long time ago that I did. It was co-hosted by they were both two of my guests, actually. I wouldn't say they were co-hosting. It was a guy named Josh who worked in La Brea tar pits, and also a guy named Tim who actually was part of this National Geographic documentary about looking for this preserved mammoth corpse, basically the one that was found in the ice, and they were both on my channel a while back, and they were sorry,
is that little baby one, Liuba?
There was a baby one that was found, yes, and there was a bigger one too. There were both, I think. There was the big one and the baby. They were found. There were several of them, and I think they're now confined to St. Petersburg Museum of Natural History, which is where a lot of these big mammoths and other like woolly rhinos and all that stuff is currently being housed at, which I've never been to yet, by the way, surprisingly. So I'll need to go there as well. And the Moscow collection of to see some of these Tarbosaurus specimens and Sauroholophus and stuff like that.
Nice.
So we'll definitely get to see that and maybe give you some material to work on in the future too, to give you a bit more hands. So
I love that.
Yeah, mammoth steaks.
Mm-hmm. I'm amazed that people actually manage to hunt these things because, it makes sense with the little woolly mammoths and maybe the little mastodons, but when you start getting to larger ones, you think, would they really have done that? I mean, these are the kinds of things you'd probably want to specifically build houses in hard-to-reach places just so they don't trample them kind of size.
There's another thing to note is that, of course, a single animal, it's like, think of it this way, it wasn't just like one family and that was it, it was a whole tribe basically was being fed at the time when these hunts were happening. They were just like sharing this whole thing because they were living in generally smaller communities. It wasn't like they were, a whole city like worth of people, population, like not 1.5 million or like 10, 12 million. There was like, at best, maybe you're talking like maybe a couple hundreds at most, probably. I would imagine at least 1,000 at most, but like that's already talking like crazy. So yeah,
that's amazing.
But that would be crazy to see how they do it, and the amount of stuff they built, from the leftovers, like from the bones and tusks and all that stuff. Like the huts, they built the huts from the.
Oh yeah, the tusk huts. Yes,
it's quite nice. Need to make some of these in my models. Maybe someday just be like make a hut reconstruction of the caveman or something like that.
Nice.
That would be quite cool. So, what else have you got for us, Harry? Yeah.
Okay, so I think it's probably time to wrap it up by putting it all together. Would you like the terrestrial size or the overall macro size? I don't really mind. Of all the green animals.
Choice to say. Right. Tough choice. Let's go with the terrestrial. Probably, I would probably say we're doing the terrestrial segment anyway, so might as well.
Yeah, I think we'll just leave this one as a little teaser for later. We can actually, for next time maybe, depending on how we do for time. So this is a lot of these animals scaled directly up together. So that same bush elephant from before, the same Paleoartist from before, the same Patagonia and Tyrannosaurus from before, all now scaled in together, and you can really see just how much perspective you can get from them. And adding in Triceratops, Quetzalcoatlus, and Shantungosaurus, you can really capture how big some animals could get, even compared to other dinosaurs or the biggest mammals, and find they really surprisingly scale up in ways I wouldn't expect. Like, the African bush elephant and the Tyrannosaurus, the Tyrannosaurus has a long tail, but otherwise they would be very similar size and mass. And in many ways, the bush elephant is bigger. And that's not even counting, Paleoartist, which probably would give Shantungosaurus a run for its money, and in many ways matches Brachiosaurus in proportions.
Yeah, it's almost like Brachiosaurus without the tail and the neck at this point. It's also, I believe that this is the same African bush elephant that you picked for the big sort of top size, basically. It's not the average size,
Yeah, so this is basically the absolute maximum probable size of everything. Shantungosaurus, I've seen depictions where there was a 5-meter scale bar, but I realized, besides the fact that the 5-meter and other 5-meter scale bar didn't actually match 5 meters, I figured, okay, I'm just going to dismiss that. I'm just going to find something a bit more down to earth about the scale. I must apologize. I can't verify certainly if Shantungosaurus walked quadrupedally. Apparently, a lot of ornithopods with long back legs and shorter front legs actually might have walked bipedally instead, but they did probably support their weight at some point on 4 limbs because they're very suitable for walking all the same. Quetzalcoatlus, despite its huge scale, is actually a very small animal. It's probably about 200, maybe 300 kilos at the most extreme maximum estimate. It was actually very light for its size, and it actually had very strong limbs. But yeah, it's quite something else. And Triceratops, as you can see, this is probably based on one of the biggest specimens I could find that was relatively intact. It probably grew quite a bit bigger than that still. And you can see that in many ways, it's very close to the size of Tyrannosaurus. You can see why they were so successful and weren't like some rare oddity that fell prey to whatever. It was clearly something that dominated the landscape, given how prevalent its fossils are.
You will have to also bear in mind that with the trikes, you have at least 2 properly described species of the late Cretaceous prior to their extinction. And one of the species, the earlier species, is the Horridus, and or it would be Horridus, properly pronounced in Latin. And you have the other one, which is a Prorsus, which is the later species. And I believe Prorsus may have even gotten a bit chunkier and more massive than Horridus, although I cannot directly verify it, but it's all just the sort of referred photographs and things like that, which are not put together to scale to kind of compare them. It's more like they're on their own. And sometimes I see some Triceratops prorsus skulls that are just huge. They're like, they blow your mind how big they can get, and it's insane. So there may even be a third intermediate species, which we don't know. Maybe there are, maybe they are just like borderline. Maybe it's either one, just kind of slightly earlier versions of them. So it's hard to say how they actually evolved, these trikes. But Horridus definitely is not probably the top sort of size for especially the Chasmosaurian, because there are other ones out there. There's an Eotriceratops which contests, but it's very hard to pinpoint because Triceratops prorsus may actually be the same size or even maybe bigger than the Eotrike. And there's a Torosaurus as well, which is about the same as T. Horridus, I think, roughly. So there were tons of these big Chasmosaurians. I mean, tons, obviously not as numerous as the earlier ones, but still quite big. And Quetzalcoatlus is particularly curious. And the reason I say this is because of how absolutely slim it is compared to anything on this chart. And of course, for a good reason, because they needed to be able to take off and fly. So there is that.
And I think there's actually a lot of things I'd love to say about Quetzalcoatlus, Triceratops as well, but I think, we could actually save it for later, because I could go on for ages about each of them. Before I do, I'll point out this Triceratops is in fact Horridus. So keep that in mind when factoring in everything that AK said about the scale and how it's probably maybe not one of the biggest ones, but yeah, so that's just something to keep in mind. But there are a lot of interesting ecological things, physiological things, and just all the fossil discoveries found around Triceratops that actually makes it even more amazing than it seems from first impressions. It is an absolutely spectacular animal and a ridiculously successful one as well. It's not just something they found once in a while. It really dominated the landscapes that it was found in.
That is very interesting, and the tricky about Triceratops is because a lot of, especially Triceratops horridus specimens, is that a lot of them tend to be younger adults, and there are not a lot that are frequently, that you can frequently find that are actually more older adults. You do need to hunt for them quite a bit to actually find them. And another thing, of course, that you will be happy to hear, and which is why maybe it might deserve its own kind of dedicated video when we get together to chat again about Triceratops specifically, is because there are a lot of Triceratops fans on this channel.
Oh, absolutely, and with good reason.
It's a big enough army to make a Triceratops cavalry unit, literally.
Yes. Oh my God, they would really be something. I mean, one thing I will share is it looks like that frill of theirs, contrary to popular belief, and this is something that happens a lot with dinosaurs, when they find a thin, seemingly brittle bone, they assume that, this must have been a display feature, it couldn't work. Nope, it very much did work, and the fossil evidence proves it. There are Triceratopses with Tyrannosaurus bite marks around the frill. Now, this might not seem spectacular, but when you consider that a Tyrannosaurus has enough bite force to it's basically the equivalent of a steamroller falling on top of you. Like, for that frill to even be there, to have those scratch marks, indicates that something's stopping it from just basically chewing through the bone like a biscuit.
And it open like that, yeah.
And that would mean that the Tyrannosaurus isn't actually capable of biting through the frill, and that would most likely be because it has very hard, ironically named soft tissue, integument scales, probably some kind of hardened keratin covering that.
It's a scale on the frill.